The wind, a mournful banshee, shrieked around the gables of the Elmwood orphanage, rattling windows in their ancient frames. Inside, the 20 children nestled deeper into their thin blankets, the blustery night making their dreams a kaleidoscope of shadow and fleeting light. A loose shutter banged rhythmically against the stone wall of the boys' dormitory, a percussive counterpoint to the distant hoot of an owl. Even the robust oak doors seemed to groan under the unseen pressure of the gale. Miss Agatha, her sensible woolen dressing gown pulled tight, moved through the darkened halls with the quiet precision of a seasoned sentinel. Her silver hair, usually coiled in a severe bun, had escaped in a few wisps around her temples, softened by the low lamplight. She paused at the threshold of the girls' dormitory, her gaze sweeping across the rows of cots. 8 small forms, breathing softly, visible as faint humps beneath the patchwork quilts. She mentally ticked them off. Hilara, Penny, little Susanna, the twins, Mary and Martha, Beatrice, Clara, and the perpetually restless Lucy, finally still. A faint smile, rare and fleeting, touched her lips. Next, the boys' room. 12 beds, 12 small souls. Theodore, the eldest, always snoring, a comforting rumble. Young Thomas, still clutching his carved wooden soldier, the perpetually muddy trio, Finn, Owen, and Liam, now scrubbed clean and slumbering, and so on, down the line. Miss Agatha's count was always exact, always thorough. 20 children entrusted to her care, 20 lives she guarded with a vigilance that belied her outwardly stern demeanor. She adjusted a blanket here, straightened a pillow there, her movements gentle, almost imperceptible. The air was frigid, seeping through the old stone, but the children for now were warm enough. Satisfied, she retreated, the floorboards groaning faintly under her weight. A tiny protest in the vast silence of the sleeping house, she returned to her small, Spartan room, the faint aroma of lavender and old paper clinging to the air. A well-worn ledger lay open on her desk, the names of her charges neatly penned in her precise script. She checked the last entry, a record of the day's meager provisions, then closed the book with a soft click. The wind continued its lament outside, but inside a fragile peace reigned. Miss Agatha banked the coals in her small stove, the last ember a defiant orange eye in the encroaching gloom, and finally sought her own narrow bed. Sleep came slowly, a fitful dance with the persistent wail of the wind. Dawn arrived not with the usual blush of pink and gold, but with a shroud of thick, pearly white. The fog was a tangible entity, pressing against the windows, muffling the world in an eerie silence. It muted the usual chirp of sparrows, swallowed the distant crow of a rooster. From her window, Miss Agatha could see only a few feet, the familiar outline of the weeping willow in the yard reduced to a ghostly silhouette. A chill, unlike the bracing cold of winter, permeated the orphanage, a damp, unsettling presence that seemed to cling to the very air. She rose, dressed in her usual somber dress, and prepared the meager breakfast of oatmeal and weak tea. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, a lonely sound in the unnerving quiet. Usually by this time, the first stirrings of the children would be heard, a cough, a whisper, the creak of a bed. But this morning there was nothing, only the pervasive hush of the fog-bound world. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way up her spine. It was unlike the children to be so still. Even the deepest sleepers were usually roused by the promise of food, however unexciting. Her heart began a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She pushed open the door to the girls' dormitory. The room was bathed in the milky light of the fog, casting everything in a muted, dreamlike pallor. Her gaze swept to Alara's bed, then Penny's, then Susanna's. Her breath hitched. The beds were empty, neatly made, the blankets folded with a precision that chilled her to the bone. Not a single rumple, not a single stray thread. It was as if no one had ever slept there. A strangled cry caught in her throat. Her legs, usually so steady, felt like leaden weights. She stumbled forward, her hand reaching out, grasping at air. The 12 boys, beds, empty, made. The small wooden soldier that Thomas cherished was gone. The worn teddy bear that belonged to Finn was missing. Not a single sock lay abandoned on the floor. Not a single book tucked beneath a pillow. The very air in the dormitories felt hollowed out, devoid of the vibrant, breathing presence of children. 20 beds. All empty. All meticulously made. It was as if the children had never been there at all, or had simply evaporated into the thin morning mist. Miss Agatha stood in the center of the silent room, the eerie stillness pressing in on her, a profound vacuum where laughter and small snores should have been. The only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart, a drumbeat of rising horror in the heart of the silent orphanage. The thick fog outside seemed to press closer, a milky wall holding its breath, guarding an impossible secret. The emptiness of the beds was a scream without a sound, a call for help. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on Miss Agatha from all sides. It wasn't the gentle, sleep-laden quiet of a full orphanage, but a hollow, echoing void that vibrated with a growing dread. Samuel? Eleanor? Lily Rose? Her voice, usually so crisp and commanding, was a reedy whisper that snagged on the thick, unmoving air. She darted from the dormitory, its rows of neatly made, untouched beds mocking her, to the dining hall. The long table, cleared of supper dishes hours ago, sat pristine and empty, a silent sentinel in the gloom. Panic, cold and sharp, began to bloom in her chest, its tendrils wrapping around her heart. She checked the common room, the scattered toys and half-finished embroidery still hinting at recent life, yet no one was there. Not a giggle, not a whispered secret, not even the rustle of a child turning in their sleep. The faint scent of forgotten biscuits and liniment clung to the air, but the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the children was utterly absent. Her breath hitched. "This isn't right," she murmured, her gaze sweeping over the familiar, yet suddenly alien, space. The window latches were secure, the back door bolted from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. It was as if the children had simply evaporated. The idea was absurd, yet it was the only explanation her frantic mind could conjure. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled as she fumbled with the receiver on the wall-mounted telephone in her office. The crank turned with a frantic whir, each revolution a desperate plea into the ether. "Operator! Get me Sheriff Brody! It's Miss Agatha! It's urgent!" Her voice, though still tinged with an unfamiliar tremor, was gaining back some of its accustomed authority, fueled by a terrifying resolve. Within what felt like mere minutes, but was likely closer to a quarter of an hour, the rhythmic thud of horse hooves on the dirt road outside grew louder, culminating in a sharp, authoritative knock. Miss Agatha practically tore the door open. Sheriff Brody stood on the porch, his face a grim mask beneath the brim of his hat. His usually easy-going demeanor was replaced by a deep furrow in his brow. His eyes, usually twinkling with a dry wit, were now sharp and grave. He was a man accustomed to the predictable rhythms of rural life: stray dogs, minor squabbles, the occasional runaway teenager, but the urgency in Miss Agatha's voice had clearly shaken him. "Miss Agatha," he said, his voice low and serious, stepping inside. "What's happened?" He took in her disheveled hair, the stark paleness of her face, the way her hands clasped and unclasped in front of her apron. He didn't need her to articulate the terror. It radiated from her in waves. "The children, Sheriff," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "They're gone. All of them." Sheriff Brody's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask who they were. The orphanage was the heart of their small community. He moved with purpose, his heavy boots echoing on the polished wood floor. He began his methodical sweep of the silent building, his gaze missing nothing. He checked under beds, peered into wardrobes, even opened the pantry door, his lamp casting long, dancing shadows. The sheriff moved from room to room, the beam of his lantern cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. He surveyed the empty dormitories, the untouched beds, the quiet play area. A small wooden soldier lay abandoned on the floor, testament to a game abruptly ended. He picked it up, turning it over in his large hand, a puzzled expression deepening on his face. The lack of any forced entry, the eerie stillness, the complete absence of a struggle, it all added up to a terrifying blank. The scene was too tidy, too orderly for a simple kidnapping. It was as if the very air had swallowed them whole. He slowly lowered the wooden toy, his eyes sweeping the silent, empty rooms once more, a profound question etched into his grim features. There was no obvious answer, no trail to follow, just an unsettling, profound void where the laughter and life of children should have been. No trace. The crisp morning air offered no solace, only a biting chill that seemed to seep into Sheriff Brody's bones. He'd started his meticulous sweep at dawn, the first rays of sunlight painting the orphanage's familiar clapboard a sickly yellow. Every rosebush in the overgrown garden had been scrutinized, every fallen leaf turned over. He'd run his gloved hands along the weathered planks of the old barn, the wood rough against the leather, searching for a snagged piece of fabric, a splintered board, anything out of place. The barn, mostly used for storing forgotten farm implements and Mrs. Gable's dried herbs, offered only the smell of dust and the faint musk of hay that hadn't seen a horse in years. Next, the outhouse, a rickety structure leaning precariously towards the woods. Inside, the air was thick with the usual stench, but no sign of disturbance. No overturned bucket, no scraped-away dirt near the foundation. He even checked the small, cracked window, too high and narrow for any child to slip through. The ground surrounding it, mostly hard-packed earth, revealed nothing but the shallow imprints of his own boots and the faint tracks of a rabbit. Brody moved with a methodical, almost desperate precision. His eyes, usually sharp and discerning, now felt heavy with a growing sense of futility. He scanned the perimeter fence, tracing its jagged line through the dew-kissed grass. Not a single post was broken, no wire snapped, no section bent or loosened. The gate, a simple latch-and-hook affair, was still securely fastened, just as Mrs. Gable had found it. He crouched by the kitchen window. The one Sister Agnes swore had been locked from the inside. The glass was intact, reflecting the gray sky like a murky mirror. No scuff marks on the sill, no telltale smudges of desperate fingers. He checked the latch again, firm and unyielding. It was as if the children had simply evaporated. The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The yard itself, usually churned into muddy rivulets by dozens of small feet, was oddly pristine. A light frost had settled overnight, creating a delicate, ephemeral crust on the sparse patches of grass. There were no footprints other than his own, and the hurried, shallow impressions of Mrs. Gable and Sister Agnes. No signs of struggle, no discarded toys, no dropped buttons. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the growing murmur from the road. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows, the townspeople began to gather. First, a trickle, then a steady stream, their buggies and wagons lining the dirt road leading to the orphanage. They stood in small, anxious clusters beyond the fence, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the ground, carried on the breeze. "It's a curse, I tell you," Elara Vance muttered, clutching her shawl tighter, her eyes wide with superstitious dread. "That land's always been ill-fated." Or worse, Josiah Albright, the town's undertaker, added, his voice a low rumble. Something unnatural. His gaze swept towards the woods, where the ancient gnarled oaks stood like silent sentinels. "They say the gypsies passed through last week," another voice offered, laced with suspicion, "always taking what ain't theirs." Brody heard them, their fearful pronouncements a dull thrum beneath his own racing thoughts. He knew the stories, the local legends of ill luck and dark magic that clung to the edges of this isolated town like tenacious burrs. But he was a man of facts, of evidence. And there was none. Only an impossible emptiness where 23 children had been the night before. He pushed open the main door of the orphanage, the familiar scent of old wood and faint disinfectant washing over him. The hall was still, too still. He walked through the empty dormitories, each cot neatly made, the blankets folded with a precision that mocked the chaos of the disappearance. He ran his hand over a small wooden horse left on a bedside table, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. No note, no message, no sign of a hurried departure. It was as if a giant hand had simply scooped them up, leaving no trace behind. The realization settled in his gut like a lead weight. This wasn't just a runaway or a kidnapping. This was something far more unsettling. Finn's memory. The familiar tang of damp straw and horseflesh, usually a soothing balm, offered Finn no solace this morning. Instead, it merely intensified the dense, unshakable dread that clung to him. He groomed Buttercup, the stable's senior mare, his brushstrokes across her dappled coat so abstracted they'd ordinarily earn him a sharp reprimand from Old Man Giles. But Giles was absent, likely at the orphanage himself, consumed by worry over the missing children. Finn's gaze drifted past Buttercup's broad flank, through the wide stable door, and out to the dusty thoroughfare. The sun, typically a welcome presence, now felt harsh and unforgiving, spotlighting the eerie void where children's laughter and shouts should have been. This unsettling stillness had persisted since dawn, a gaping wound in the town's very fabric. His mind, typically a placid pool, now churned with a singular, insistent image. He'd been returning from a feed delivery to Mrs. Gable's scrawny fowl, long after the curfew bell had chimed. The moon, a mere sliver, rendered the path behind the orphanage almost indiscernible. That's when he'd seen it. Not a specter, though the memory still caught his breath, but something nearly as disquieting. A wagon. It wasn't Farmer McGregor's lumbering cart, nor the baker's familiar delivery van. This was different. Significantly larger for one, and painted a nondescript, forgettable black. What truly set it apart, however, were the curtains, thick, dark fabric, drawn tightly over every window, impenetrable. It wasn't on the main road, but tucked into the sickly elm grove at the orphanage's rear, as if intentionally concealed. He caught only a fleeting glimpse, a flicker of movement within the tree's shadows, as he'd hurried past, attempting to make himself small, invisible. He'd initially presumed it was merely a late supply drop for the orphanage, perhaps a coal delivery, though the clandestine nature had pricked at him even then. Now it screamed, the wagon. The black drapes, the way it had seemed to melt into the night. Finn clenched his jaw, the brush still in hand, its rough bristles digging into his palm. He hadn't spoken of it, not yet. He'd tried, opening his mouth several times that morning, but the words had snagged in his throat, entangled with an unnamed fear. What if he was mistaken? What if it amounted to nothing? He was just Finn, the stable boy, easily dismissed. A sudden commotion from the street jolted him. Sheriff Brody, his broad shoulders squared, emerged from the orphanage, his face grim. In his gloved hand he held something small and glinting, a knot tightened in Finn's gut. He leaned against Buttercup, striving for inconspicuousness, but his eyes were riveted on the sheriff. Brody paused at the foot of the orphanage steps, his gaze sweeping the hushed assembly of townsfolk, as though seeking answers in their worried countenances. Then, with a profound sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the morning's grim discovery, he held up the object. It was a silver locket, tarnished with dirt yet still recognizable. Sunlight caught its polished surface, making it gleam momentarily. Finn's breath hitched again. He knew that locket. He'd often seen Clara, one of the older girls, polishing it after Sunday chapel. She'd once shown it to him proudly. Inside, a tiny, faded image of her mother, who'd passed years ago. Sheriff Brody's voice, typically a booming command, was subdued, strained. "We found this near the back fence, tangled in some brambles." He paused, allowing the implication to hang heavy in the air. "It belongs to Clara." He snapped the locket open, revealing the miniature portrait. She must have dropped it. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. A woman openly sobbed. Finn felt a chill deeper than any winter morning. Clara. Sweet, quiet Clara, who always shared her extra biscuit. The locket was stark, undeniable evidence, pulling Clara, and by extension all the children, closer to a terrifying truth. The image of the black-curtained wagon slammed into Finn's mind again, sharper, more urgent. It wasn't just a late delivery. It couldn't be. The secrecy, the darkness, the missing children, and now Clara's locket. He swallowed hard, the taste of dust and fear coating his tongue. He had to speak. He had to tell Sheriff Brody. The words still felt heavy, but the alternative, silence, felt infinitely heavier, and far more perilous. He pushed himself off Buttercup, his small frame suddenly resolute, into the fog. The cold still clung to the air, a damp shroud that had yet to fully dissipate, even as the first tentative rays of morning struggled to pierce the thick, cottony veil. Sheriff Brody, his breath pluming in front of him, squinted at the ground. The faint impression of wagon wheels, barely discernible in the soft earth at the edge of town, was their only guide. Finn, astride a sturdy bay mare, sat quietly beside him, his gaze sharp and unwavering, fixed on the same barely there indentations. The heavy silver locket, now nestled securely in the inner pocket of Finn's worn jacket, felt like a small, cold stone against his ribs, a tether to a past he couldn't fully recall, yet somehow knew was vital. "These are it, Finn." Brody's voice was a low rumble, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. Finn nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "The pattern, I remember it. A nick on the front right wheel, just so." He pointed a gloved finger to a tiny, jagged imperfection in the track. "It always caught on something." "Always." His voice was soft, barely above a whisper, yet infused with an unexpected certainty. Brody grunted, a sound of grim satisfaction. Trust Finn's memory for the small, overlooked details. They spurred their horses forward, following the ghost-like trail. The fog, dense and clinging, muffled the sounds of their horses. Hooves swallowed the distant caw of a crow and distorted the familiar shapes of the surrounding landscape. The world shrunk to the narrow path ahead, defined only by the faint tracks and the shifting gray curtain that obscured anything beyond a few feet. Hours bled into one another. The chill seeped into their bones, a constant, gnawing presence. Finn rode with an uncharacteristic stillness, his eyes scanning, not just for the tracks, but for anything amiss, a broken branch, a discarded item, any sign that might betray the purpose of the vanished wagon. His mind, usually a jumble of fleeting images and half-formed thoughts, was now a finely tuned instrument, focused on the task at hand. The locket's weight was a constant reminder, a silent hum of urgency beneath his jacket. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fog began to thin. Patches of pale blue sky, like faded denim, appeared overhead. The shapes of trees, previously indistinct blurs, sharpened into gaunt silhouettes. The air, though still cool, lost some of its damp, suffocating weight. Yet, as the mist receded, a new sense of foreboding settled in. The landscape around them was becoming wilder, less traveled. The tracks, though still present, were less distinct, hinting at a journey taken hastily, perhaps even desperately. They had left the open fields behind, the rolling hills giving way to a denser, more imposing terrain. The sun, finally breaking through the last wisps of fog, cast long, distorted shadows through the ancient oak and maple trees that now lined their path. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The wagon tracks, now clearer, veered sharply, leading them directly into the dark maw of a dense forest. "Looks like they were heading for the old logging roads," Brody observed, his voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the woods. "Not many folks go this deep anymore, not without a good reason." He eyed the tangled undergrowth, the gnarled roots that snaked across the forest floor. Finn shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The trees here were different. Taller, older, their branches intertwined overhead like skeletal fingers, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. He remembered a story his grandmother used to tell of the Whispering Woods, where shadows played tricks on the eyes and ancient spirits held sway. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the deep ruts the wagon had carved into the soft, dark soil. This was no place for children, the abandoned wagon. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as they pushed deeper into the woods. Sunlight, once a playful dappling through the canopy, now struggled to pierce the dense overhead net of branches, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The easy chatter that had accompanied their journey earlier had long since faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of their boots and the distant caw of a crow, a sound that seemed to echo the unsettling quietude. Finn, usually content to trail slightly behind, found himself drawing closer, his eyes scanning the gloom with an intensity that belied his often dreamy demeanor. His gaze, always quick to notice the small details others missed, caught a flicker of something unnatural through a tangle of briars, a patch of faded, deep black. He paused, a hand held up, and the others halted, their heads cocked, listening. "There," Finn whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustle of a squirrel in the undergrowth. He pointed with a slender finger. "Through there." Something dark. They pushed through the thorny thicket, the branches snagging at their clothes and hair, until the woods opened slightly into a small, neglected clearing. And there it was. Not a cabin, not a tent, but an old wagon. It sat tilted precariously on one broken wheel, half buried in a carpet of moss and fallen leaves, as if it had simply been abandoned mid-journey and forgotten by the world. Its wooden frame, once painted a cheerful red, was now a peeling, sun-bleached husk, its edges softened by years of rain and frost. What truly struck them, however, were the curtains. They were a heavy, almost funereal black, torn in places, but still largely intact, clinging stubbornly to the small, grimy windows. They looked utterly out of place, an unsettling splash of darkness against the muted greens and browns of the forest. The wagon seemed to exhale a chill that had nothing to do with the fading light. "Well, I'll be," one of them muttered, the words sounding unusually loud in the stillness. Finn approached cautiously, his steps light, almost reverent. He reached out a hesitant hand to one of the curtains, his fingers tracing the coarse, sun-rotted fabric. It crumbled slightly at his touch, releasing a puff of dust that smelled of disuse and mildew. He peered through a tear, but the interior was too dark to discern anything. With a shared, unspoken decision, they moved to the back of the wagon. The tailgate, stiff with rust, groaned in protest as they managed to wrench it open. A cloud of ancient dust billowed out, catching the weak shafts of light that managed to penetrate the clearing. Inside, there was nothing. No trunks, no boxes, no bedding. Just a thick layer of matted, soiled straw spread across the floor. It smelled faintly of animal, perhaps a horse, but also of something indefinable, something stale and sad. It was utterly empty, a hollow shell. The mystery deepened, rather than resolved. Who would abandon a wagon, curtains drawn, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but straw inside? Finn stepped into the wagon, his boots sinking slightly into the straw. He ran his hands along the wooden walls, his fingers finding no hidden compartments, no secret messages. The silence in the clearing pressed in around them, heavy and expectant. Then it came, faint at first, a wisp of sound carried on the barely perceptible breeze. It was a melody, high and sweet, unmistakably a child's voice. A lullaby, perhaps, but sung with an ethereal, almost mournful quality. It was a tune none of them recognized, ancient and simple, drifting from deeper within the woods. Finn froze, his head cocked, listening intently. The singing was indistinct, just on the edge of audibility, a phantom echo. But it was there, and it was beckoning. His eyes, usually so focused on the ground, now lifted, piercing the gloom beyond the clearing, drawn by the invisible thread of sound. The emptiness of the wagon, the unsettling quiet of their discovery, now had a counterpoint, a strange, unsettling promise. Without a word, he stepped out of the wagon, his gaze fixed on the direction from which the singing emanated, and began to walk. The others followed, their steps no longer hesitant but driven by a new, compelling urgency, a warm welcome. The haunting melody, thin and reedy, drifted through the pines, a sound both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Finn, usually so stoic, felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, prickling the hairs on his arms. Beside him, Sheriff Brody's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his revolver, though his movements were slow, cautious. They moved like shadows, each fallen leaf and snapping twig a potential betrayer in the deepening twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something sweet, like baking bread. "Careful now, Finn," Brody whispered, his voice a low rumble. "Could be a trap." Finn merely nodded, his eyes wide and scanning the dense undergrowth. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and fear. He wasn't sure what they expected to find. A desperate bandit's lair, perhaps, or something far more sinister. But the sound of children singing, however ethereal, suggested something else entirely. It was a lullaby, almost. A soft, soothing tune that felt utterly out of place in the wild, unforgiving woods. They crept through a thicket of blackberry bushes, thorns snagging at their clothes, until the trees began to thin. A pale glow flickered ahead, painting the trunks with an ethereal light. Finn's breath caught in his throat. He pulled back on Brody's sleeve, a silent signal, and pointed. Through a natural break in the foliage, they saw it, a hidden clearing, perfectly circular, as if a giant's thumb had pressed down on the forest floor. In the center, a fire crackled merrily, sending plumes of fragrant smoke into the darkening sky, and gathered around it, not a dozen, but all 20 orphans, every single one of them. A wave of disbelief washed over Finn, momentarily eclipsing his caution. He counted them, twice, 3 times, his gaze flitting from face to familiar face. Little Rosie, her red hair a fiery halo in the firelight. Stout Thomas, usually so boisterous, now utterly captivated. The quiet twins, Mary and Martha, pressed close together. They were all there, their eyes wide and shining, not with terror, but with a profound sense of peace. And in the midst of them, her silver hair gleaming like spun moonlight, sat Granny Willow. She wasn't bound, wasn't threatened. She sat cross-legged on a thick woolen blanket, her hands busy. As Finn watched, mesmerized, she tore a piece from a large, round loaf of bread, still steaming, its crust a golden brown, and handed it to a small boy with tear tracks on his cheeks. The boy took it reverently, his small teeth sinking into the soft crumb. Granny Willow was speaking, her voice a gentle murmur that carried easily on the still air. She wasn't singing now, but telling a story. Her hands moved expressively, painting vivid pictures in the air. The children leaned forward, utterly engrossed, their faces reflecting the shifting emotions of her narrative. Laughter rippled through the clearing at one point, soft and genuine. A few moments later, a collective sigh of suspense. Brody, beside him, seemed to have forgotten the revolver. His jaw was slack, his eyes fixed on the scene. Finn felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest, chasing away the chill of the evening. This wasn't a kidnapping, it wasn't a ritual, it was a gathering. A very peculiar, very secret gathering. And so, the little fox found his way home, guided by the very stars he had wished upon. Granny Willow concluded, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. A chorus of soft oohs and ahs rose from the children. Then little Rosie, bolder than the rest, piped up, "Tell us another, Granny, please!" Granny Willow smiled, a warm, crinkling smile that reached her eyes. She reached for another loaf of bread, equally golden and fragrant, and began tearing it into generous chunks. "Patience, little ones. Stories need time to settle, like good dough. But first, let's fill those bellies. This bread, baked with a touch of magic and a lot of love, will give you strength for the journey ahead." "Journey ahead?" Finn exchanged a quick, bewildered glance with Brody. What journey? And where? The scent of the fresh bread was intoxicating, making Finn's own stomach rumble. The children, despite their ordeal, seemed content, even joyful. They ate with gusto, their small hands clutching the warm bread, crumbs dusting their lips. Granny Willow watched them, her expression serene, a silent guardian over her unexpected flock. "What in the blazes?" Brody breathed, his voice barely audible. It was less a question and more an expression of utter bewilderment. Finn had no answer. This wasn't what they had prepared for, not what they had feared. The macabre mystery had taken an entirely unexpected turn. The children weren't missing. They were simply here, and it seemed they were having a very warm welcome indeed. The mystery, however, remained. Why here, and why in such secrecy? Granny Willow's tale. The flickering hearth cast dancing shadows across Granny Willow's weathered face, carving deeper lines around her kind, crinkling eyes. A cup of steaming herbal tea sat forgotten in her gnarled hands as she finally spoke, her voice a low murmur, like the gentle rush of a hidden stream. "Children," she began, her gaze sweeping over Finn, who sat on a low stool, elbows on his knees, absorbing every word. "You must understand. The fog." It was a living thing that night. Thick as wool, cold as a tomb, and it clung to everything, even the very air you breathed. Finn shivered, remembering the suffocating blanket of mist that had swallowed the orphanage. He'd only seen glimpses of it from his window, but the memory still made his stomach knot. "I was out late, you see," Granny Willow continued, her eyes distant, reliving the moment. "Gathering herbs by the old creek bed. The moon was a mere rumor behind the haze, and the chill bit right to the bone. That's when I heard it, a faint whimper carried on the wind, like a lost lamb." She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea, the warmth seeming to infuse her ancient bones. I followed the sound, my lamp barely piercing the gloom. And there they were, huddled beneath the ancient oak by the orphanage gates, shivering, their little bodies shaking so hard I thought they might shatter. Finn pictured the scene vividly. The small, forlorn figures, no older than himself, exposed to the elements. His heart ached with a familiar pang of empathy. He'd often felt that same profound chill, that same gnawing hunger in his early days at the orphanage. Their faces were blue with cold, their teeth chattering like castanets. She recounted, a sorrowful note entering her voice. And their bellies were empty. You could tell by the way they clutched themselves, trying to hold in some semblance of warmth that simply wasn't there. They were starving, those poor mites. Granny Willow set her cup down with a soft clink. My heart, it broke. To leave them there, in that awful fog, to face the night alone? I couldn't. Not a soul could. She looked directly at Finn then, her gaze unwavering. So, I did what any decent soul would. I gathered them up, one by one. Their little hands were like ice, their clothes thin and ragged. I led them back here, to my humble cottage, where there was warmth, and a little food, and a roof over their heads for just one night. Finn's mind raced, connecting the dots. It made sense. Granny Willow's home was small, but incredibly cozy. He could imagine the scent of wood smoke and chamomile, the gentle glow of the fire, chasing away the bone-deep cold. It was a haven. It was never meant to be permanent, mind you, she clarified, picking up a stray thread from her apron. Just a temporary reprieve from the cruel weather. My plan, my only plan, was to keep them safe and fed until morning. And then, once the fog had lifted, once the sun had broken through and the world was clear again, I intended to walk them right back to the orphanage. A heavy sigh escaped her lips. I thought it would be a simple matter, a kind deed, nothing more. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off, her gaze once again distant. lost in the swirling mists of that fateful night. The fire crackled, the only sound in the small, silent room, a testament to the untold part of her story that still hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the fog itself. Home again. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth still clung to the children as they emerged from the tree line, blinking in the sudden brightness of the late morning sun. Their laughter, light and unburdened, carried across the clearing. Granny Willow, her smile as warm as the hearth, watched them go, a silent benediction in her eyes. Then they saw them, two figures, etched against the distant backdrop of the Elmwood orphanage, now looking impossibly small. One, a rigid silhouette with a formidable hat. The other, broad-shouldered and stoic. "Miss Agatha!" A collective cry burst from the children, the sound a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. Finn, usually reserved, was among the first to break into a run, his small legs pumping furiously. The others followed, a flurry of patched clothes and uncombed hair, their faces alight with the simple happiness of reunion. Miss Agatha, who had been pacing a rut into the earth, stopped mid-stride. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. Sheriff Brody, who had been scanning the horizon with a grin set to his jaw, lowered his binoculars, his expression transforming from weary concern to profound relief. "Children! Oh, thank heavens!" Miss Agatha's voice, usually a crisp, authoritative tone, was thick with emotion. She stumbled forward, her usually impeccable bun slightly askew, her starched apron rumpled. She swept the first two into a fierce hug, oblivious to the mud on their shoes or the wild tangle of their hair. Finn, shyly holding back, watched the scene unfold. He saw the genuine, raw relief on Miss Agatha's face, a stark contrast to her usual composed demeanor. He realized, with a jolt, that she had been truly, deeply worried. Not just annoyed, as she sometimes was when they tracked mud indoors, but genuinely terrified. "Where in the name of... where have you been?" Sheriff Brody's voice, though firm, held an undercurrent of awe as he took in the sight of the healthy, smiling children. "We had a magical sleepover," piped up Lily, her eyes sparkling. "With Granny Willow, she made us pancakes shaped like bears." "And we heard stories about the Moonweaver," added Thomas, eager to share their adventure. The adults exchanged bewildered glances. Magical sleepover? They had pictured grim scenarios, dark woods, perhaps even, they had tried not to picture anything too specific, but it had certainly involved far less pancake-shaped whimsy. Miss Agatha finally released the last child from her embrace, her eyes welling up. She turned to Granny Willow, who had approached slowly, her hands clasped. "Granny Willow," Miss Agatha began, her voice cracking, I don't know what to say. We feared the worst. The entire county has been searching." Granny Willow merely smiled, her gaze soft. "They were safe, dear. Just needed a little warmth and a different sort of story for a night." Miss Agatha reached out, taking Granny Willow's gnarled hand in both of hers. "You saved us from an unimaginable sorrow. You offered them shelter and kindness when we were beside ourselves with worry. How can I ever repay you?" Her voice was laced with an earnest gratitude that Finn had never heard from her before. It was a raw, unfiltered emotion that softened the sharp edges of her usual persona. "No repayment needed, child," Granny Willow replied, her voice a gentle murmur. "The joy on their faces is payment enough. They filled this old cabin with laughter, and that's a gift." Sheriff Brody, looking somewhat sheepish, cleared his throat. "Well, ma'am, we owe you a great debt of gratitude, and perhaps a formal apology for the extensive search efforts." He nodded towards the distant line of searchers, now a faint smudge on the horizon, slowly beginning to disband. The children, oblivious to the relief and the logistical nightmares their absence had caused, chattered excitedly amongst themselves, recounting the wonders of Granny Willow's cabin. They seemed to have no concept of the panic, the fear, the sleepless nights Miss Agatha and the others had endured. To them, it had been an adventure, a brief, enchanting detour. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows, it was time to leave. Miss Agatha, her composure slowly returning, though a tremor still lingered in her voice, began to gather her flock. "Come along, children. It's time to go home. There's a warm meal waiting, and perhaps a good scrub for those who've managed to collect half the forest on their clothes." Her gaze, though still tear-stained, held a familiar, fond exasperation. Finn, who had been quietly observing the adults, felt a pang of sadness. The magic of Granny Willow's cabin, the stories, the warmth, it was all being left behind. But as he looked at Miss Agatha, truly looked at her, he saw not just the strict matron, but a woman whose heart had been on the verge of breaking. He saw the fierce love that had fueled her frantic search, and he understood, in that moment, the true meaning of home. It wasn't just a place, it was the people who cared enough to worry. The walk back to Elmwood Orphanage was quieter than the run-out. The children, their initial burst of energy expended, walked alongside Miss Agatha and Sheriff Brody, a little more subdued, perhaps sensing the gravity of the situation they had inadvertently caused. The mystery of their disappearance was solved, not with a nefarious plot, but with a simple act of profound kindness. The orphanage, with its familiar walls and routines, now seemed like a beacon, a safe harbor after an unexpected journey. They were home again, and the world, for now, felt righted.